The advertisement in the Tucson Territorial Gazette read simply, "Schoolteacher wanted, 2 boys ages 9 and 11, remote ranch outside Millhaven, compensation fair. Inquire at the Thatcher spread 12 miles north on the Sonoran Road." What it did not say, what nobody had bothered to say, was that those 2 boys had already read every book within 100 miles, memorized the Latin names of desert plants, and could calculate the yield of a cattle herd faster than most bank clerks in Phoenix. Susanna Lawson folded that newspaper advertisement with precise, deliberate fingers and tucked it into the small leather satchel she carried everywhere. She had been in Tucson for exactly 11 days, having ridden the Southern Pacific Railroad from St. Louis with $73 to her name, a teaching certificate from the Missouri State Normal School, and the quiet, unshakable conviction that she was meant to be somewhere useful. Tucson, in the spring of 1883, was a city that smelled of mesquite smoke and horse leather and possibility, but it had not yet made room for her. 3 schools had politely declined her application. One schoolmaster had told her, without a trace of embarrassment, that the children of Tucson required a man's firm hand. She had thanked him, walked out into the blazing April sunlight, and bought herself a copy of the Gazette. The Thatcher advertisement was the 4th thing she had circled. She made arrangements with the Beaumont boarding house to hold her trunk, packed 3 days of clothes into her satchel alongside her books and her teaching notes, and hired a seat on a freight wagon heading north toward Millhaven before the sun had fully climbed above the Santa Catalina Mountains. The driver, a weathered man named Corbett who smelled strongly of tobacco and creek water, told her without much prompting that Jacob Thatcher was a widower, that his wife Alina had died of fever 3 winters past, and that the ranch was the finest spread in the county, but that "those boys of his are peculiar ones, miss, and I don't mean that unkindly." "Peculiar how?" Susanna asked, watching the saguaro cacti move past like tall green sentinels in the morning light. Corbett scratched beneath his hat. "Quiet like. The older one, Eli, he don't say much, but when he does you'd better listen. The younger one, Thomas, he talks plenty, but half of what he says goes right over a grown man's head. Thatcher himself now, he's a good man, hard-working, decent, but he worries something fierce about those boys, says they need schooling proper-like, says they're falling behind." Susanna looked out across the desert, the road wound between stands of Ocotillo and Palo Verde, the sky above them a flat, burning blue that felt almost solid. "Falling behind," she repeated, more to herself than to Corbett. "That's what he says." She did not respond to that. She simply folded her hands in her lap and watched the landscape open up around her, all that vast and terrifying and beautiful emptiness. And she thought, as she often did when entering a new situation, about what it meant to truly see a person before deciding what they needed. The Thatcher Ranch announced itself first through cattle, a long, reddish-brown river of them moving across a distant hillside, and then through a stand of cottonwood trees along an arroyo that gave the whole property a softness it might not otherwise have had. The main house was built of adobe brick, thick-walled and low, with a wide covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There were corrals and outbuildings and a bunkhouse set back from the main structure, and everywhere Susanna looked there were signs of a working ranch. Ropes coiled on fence posts, boots lined up on the porch steps, a saddle draped over a hitching rail with a patience that suggested it had been there a while. She stepped down from the freight wagon before Corbett had fully stopped it, landing with a soft thud in the Arizona dust, and looked at the house. The door was open. From somewhere inside she could hear a voice, young, precise, certain, reciting something in what she realized, after a moment, was Latin. Corbett tipped his hat and moved his wagon on, having a delivery to make at the next property east. Susanna stood alone at the gate and listened. The voice was methodical, unhurried. It was reciting what she recognized with a small jolt of surprise as passages from Cicero's De Orator. She walked up the porch steps and knocked on the open door frame. The Latin stopped. A boy appeared in the doorway. He was tall for 11, with dark hair and serious gray eyes and the kind of stillness that made you pay attention. He looked at her steadily, without the shyness most children displayed toward strangers. "You're the teacher," he said. "I am," said Susanna. "My name is Susanna Lawson." "And you are Eli." The boy's eyes shifted very slightly. Not surprise exactly, more like recalibration. "Corbett told you," he said. "He mentioned your name, yes, but I would have guessed from context. Your brother is Thomas, and you are clearly the elder. You have the kind of face that carries responsibility." The boy studied her for another moment. Then he stepped back and opened the door wider. "Father is in the east pasture. He'll be back by noon. Thomas is in the kitchen reading." "What were you reading just now?" Susanna asked as she stepped inside. "Cicero," said Eli. "The orator," she said. He stopped walking. He turned around slowly. "Yes," he said, "the second book." Crassus is making the argument that the ideal orator must be educated in all things. Do you agree with him? Eli tilted his head to one side. He looked in that moment profoundly like someone who was not used to being asked for his opinion by an adult. "Partly," he said carefully. "I think Crassus overstates the necessity of breadth at the expense of depth, but I understand why he values it." Susanna set her satchel down on a wooden bench inside the door. The interior of the house was spare but clean, with thick adobe walls that kept the heat at bay, a long pine table, bookshelves that were genuinely full rather than decorative, and a fireplace with a cast-iron mantel. She looked at those bookshelves for a long moment. "You have read most of those," she said. It was not quite a question. "All of them," said Eli. "Thomas too, though Thomas prefers the scientific texts to the classical ones." Susanna looked at the boy. She felt something shift inside her, not pity, nothing so condescending as that, but a kind of recognition. She had been this person. She had been the child who had read everything available, and then looked around desperately for something more, finding only adults who doubted the reading had been thorough, who tested and retested and ultimately failed to offer anything new. "Then we have our work cut out for us," she said cheerfully, "because I have not brought you anything you have already read, and I intend to make it interesting." Thomas appeared from the kitchen doorway. He was 9, smaller than his brother, with the same dark hair but brown eyes and a mouth that looked as though it was always fighting back some urgent statement. He was holding an open book which he had not set down for the introductions, and Susanna saw that it was a copy of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. "You're the teacher," he announced in the same declarative way his brother had. "Eli says you know Latin." "I do," said Susanna. "Do you know mathematics?" "I do." "Do you know natural philosophy?" "Father ordered Mr. Darwin's book from a catalog and nobody in the county will discuss it with us because Reverend Marsh says it's dangerous." "I think it's not dangerous. I think it's correct in most of its conclusions, though I have some questions about the mechanism of inheritance because it doesn't fully explain how traits pass from parent to child, and I've been thinking there might be something more precise happening at a very small scale." Susanna looked at the 9-year-old holding Darwin and proposing, in a fumbling but genuinely pointed way, the existence of what would in time be called genetics. She felt the kind of quiet delight that she had spent most of her life searching for, the sensation of standing at the edge of a truly interesting conversation. "You are absolutely right that there is something more precise happening," she said carefully. "There are men in Europe working on exactly that question right now. A monk named Gregor Mendel did experiments with peas and found specific patterns. His work has not been widely read yet, but I have a paper about it in my satchel." Thomas's mouth dropped open. He looked at his brother. Eli looked back at him with the calm of someone whose faith has just been confirmed. "Sit down," said Thomas, pointing at the chair nearest him. "Sit down right now, please," Susanna laughed. It was a full, genuine laugh, and the sound of it seemed to surprise both boys in a way that pleased them. She sat down. Thomas sat across from her immediately, still holding his book. Eli stood in the doorway between the main room and the kitchen, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, watching. That was how Jacob Thatcher found them when he came in from the east pasture at noon. His two sons and the new schoolteacher bent over a paper together, arguing with great earnestness about the transmission of inherited traits in desert tortoise populations, which Thomas had apparently been observing and recording in a journal for the past 14 months. Jacob stood in the doorway of his own house for a solid 30 seconds before anyone noticed him. He was 34 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered by the Arizona sun into something more interesting than conventionally handsome. He had dark circles under his eyes that spoke of too many late nights and early mornings, hands that were scarred from work, and a kind of guarded quality about him that sat like a second skin, the wariness of a man who had been hurt and hadn't quite finished recovering. He wore range clothes, canvas trousers, a collarless shirt, a battered hat that he took off when he stepped inside and held in both hands. He looked at the woman sitting at his table. She had light brown hair pinned up with the inevitable wisps escaping at her temples and the back of her neck. She was perhaps 26 or 27, with quick, lively dark eyes and a way of holding herself very straight, very alert, that made her seem larger than her actual size. She was gesturing at something on the paper in front of her and saying, "But you have to consider the environmental variables separately from the inherited ones. Look, if this tortoise here lives at a lower elevation with different plant availability, you cannot compare his traits directly to this one's. You have to control for the conditions." Thomas was nodding frantically and scribbling in his journal. Eli was watching her with the focused attention he usually gave only to texts he considered worth his time. Jacob cleared his throat. All three heads came up. Susanna rose immediately, the motion clean and unhurried, and extended her hand. "Mr. Thatcher, I am Susanna Lawson. I apologize for beginning without you. Your sons were very persuasive about the urgency of the matter." Jacob shook her hand. Her grip was firm. "Miss Lawson," he said, "I hope you weren't put out arriving to an empty house." "Not at all. Your sons are excellent company." Jacob looked at his boys. Thomas was already looking back at his journal notes. Eli was still watching the schoolteacher with that measuring, calibrating gaze. Jacob recognized the look. It was the same look Eli had given exactly 3 books in his whole life, the look that meant he had found something worth his sustained attention. "They told you, I expect, that they're behind in their studies," Jacob said carefully. Susanna paused almost imperceptibly. "They mentioned their reading," she said. "Mrs. Dalton from town tried to work with them last year, said Eli was stubborn and Thomas was distracted and neither of them would do the exercises she set." "What exercises?" "Basic arithmetic, spelling, the kind of thing the other children in Millhaven are doing." Susanna picked up her satchel and settled it over her arm. "Mr. Thatcher, your sons are not behind. Your son Thomas is making original observations about ecological inheritance that would be discussed at a university. Your son Eli reads classical Latin. I need to understand what kind of teaching you are hoping to engage, because if it is the kind that Mrs. Dalton was doing, I am perhaps not the right choice. But if it is the kind that meets your sons where they actually are rather than where they are imagined to be, then I would very much like the position." The silence that followed this speech was not uncomfortable. Jacob Thatcher looked at Susanna Lawson with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration, but was somewhere in the middle of both, the kind of expression a man wears when something he expected to manage has turned out instead to require his full, honest attention. "You can have the guest room," he said. $20 a month, room and board included. Breakfast at 6, dinner at 7. I'll expect to know what you're teaching them, and I'd appreciate weekly reports." "That is entirely reasonable," said Susanna. "And I would appreciate knowing what each of them is most interested in, so that I can structure the work accordingly. A child learns fastest when the subject is one that already has their heart." Jacob put his hat back on. "Ask them," he said. "They'll tell you more than I can." And then he walked back outside, because the east pasture fence had a broken post that needed attention, and because he needed a moment to think about the fact that the schoolteacher he had hired to bring his sons up to a basic standard had just told him with complete and calm certainty that they were not behind at all. He stood by the corral for a moment, his hands resting on the top rail, and looked back at the house. Through the open window he could hear Thomas's voice raised in what was clearly an excited disagreement, and then the schoolteacher's voice answering steady, interested, unruffled. He heard Eli's voice too, which was unusual in itself, because Eli did not speak often when he didn't have something worth saying. Jacob turned back to his fence post, but the sound of her voice stayed with him through the whole afternoon, like a song he hadn't meant to remember. The days settled into a rhythm quickly, the way things do when everyone involved is genuinely committed to the work. Susanna taught from 7 in the morning until noon, using the long pine table as her classroom, with both boys sitting across from her and books and papers spread between them. She had written to a bookseller in San Francisco during her first week on the ranch, ordering materials that were not available in Tucson, and she used what she had while she waited. She taught them mathematics through land survey problems and astronomical calculations. She taught them history through the letters of people who had lived it. She taught them writing by asking them to argue, in clear prose, for positions they had not yet decided they held. She was also an honest person, which meant that she observed things without flinching from what she saw. What she saw was that both boys carried their mother's absence in different ways. Thomas carried it in his furious curiosity. He asked questions about everything, as though understanding the mechanisms of the world might somehow fill the particular silence Thatcher had left. Eli carried it in his self-sufficiency. He had decided, at some point in the 3 years since his mother's death, to need nothing from anyone that could be taken away. He was kind to his brother and capable in the household and deeply, carefully unavailable in any emotional sense. She also saw Jacob Thatcher, and the more she saw of him, the more complicated that seeing became. He was a man of routines, and those routines were a form of architecture. The way he organized his days so that there was always something requiring his attention, always something physical and external and solvable. He was up before dawn. He worked the ranch with 2 hired hands, a lean and laconic older man named Hector Vargas who had been with the Thatcher family for 12 years, and a younger cowboy named Pete Drummond, who was 22 and still in the phase of his life, where he believed that speed and enthusiasm could substitute for judgment. He managed the cattle, the water rights, the supply runs to Millhaven, the repair of everything that broke, which was constant. He sat at the head of the dinner table every evening and listened to his sons talk, and they talked more now, more freely and widely than they apparently had in some time. And he asked questions that were not stupid questions, not the questions of a man performing interest, but the genuine curiosity of someone who paid attention. He was, she thought, a more intelligent man than he believed himself to be. He had told her this, in a sideways fashion, on the 3rd evening, when he had stayed at the table after the boys had gone to bed rather than going immediately back to his accounts. She had been reviewing Thomas's journal notes by lamplight, making small annotations in the margins, and he had sat across from her with a cup of coffee and looked at the books on the shelves with the expression of a man looking at something he had loved and then put away. "You read," she said, because she had noticed several of the books were worn in specific ways that indicated a regular reader rather than an occasional one. "I used to," he said. "What stopped you?" He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Alina read to me mostly. I never had the schooling for proper reading. I got letters and accounts well enough, but the books were hers." He paused. "After she was gone, it seemed like I was taking something that didn't belong to me anymore." Susanna put down her pen. She looked at him with the direct, even attention she gave to everything, and he met her eyes without shifting away, though she could see it cost him something. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "literacy is not a thing that belongs to a person. It is a skill, and it does not leave with them. You are allowed to read." "I know that," he said a little roughly. "I don't think you fully believe it." The silence that followed was not hostile. It was the silence of a man encountering a truth he had been half aware of and not yet ready to face. "Eleanor was educated," he said finally. "Proper educated. St. Louis, that's where she was from. She came west to visit her cousin and I met her at a social and we were married within the year." He looked at the table. "She was smarter than me. I always knew it. The boys take after her." "That is not," said Susanna with a precision that was not unkind, "the same thing as you being unintelligent." Jacob looked up at her. "You run a profitable cattle operation in contested territory, manage water rights that require an understanding of property law, make purchasing decisions that require arithmetic and foresight, and hired a teacher based on an advertisement that said essentially nothing. You also," she continued, "just asked your sons a question about the Gadsden purchase at dinner that led to a 40-minute discussion that required knowledge of American political history, Mexican treaty law, and the economic motivations of both governments. You participated meaningfully in that conversation." Jacob stared at her for a long moment. Then he set down his coffee cup. "You are a very direct woman, Miss Lawson," he said. "I have been told that," she agreed pleasantly. "The last teacher, Mrs. Dalton, she told me the boys were stubborn and distractible and needed discipline. They are not stubborn, they are rigorous. There is a significant difference." "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, I think there is." She picked up her pen again. He did not immediately leave. He sat for a while longer in the lamplight, and she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of the warmth of a fire, not directly looking at it but knowing it is there. After some time, he said good night and went to his study. She heard the sound of a book being taken from a shelf, and then the quiet of a man reading, and she pressed the tip of her pen to her page and smiled without meaning to. The second week brought a complication in the form of a man named Gerald Prentice. Prentice was the owner of the Millhaven Mercantile, and self-proclaimed first citizen of Millhaven, a distinction he awarded himself in all conversations, whether the conversation called for it or not. He arrived at the Thatcher Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 hired men behind him, and a proprietary air that immediately set Susanna's teeth on edge. He was perhaps 45, fleshy, with small pale eyes and the particular swagger of a man who has never been significantly challenged. She was on the porch with both boys, working through a geography lesson involving a hand-drawn map of the territories, when Prentice rode up. Eli went still in the way he had when something required evaluation. Thomas kept drawing his map, but his pencil moved more carefully, which was his version of the same thing. "Thatcher in," Prentice called. "He's in the barn," said Eli. "He did not say, sir." Prentice's eyes moved to Susanna. They assessed her in the way she had learned to recognize immediately, the assessment of a man deciding where she fit in his hierarchy. "You the school teacher?" "I am," said Susanna. "Susanna Lawson. Heard Thatcher hired someone from out of town. Didn't expect a woman." He looked at the boys. "How are you finding the students, Miss Lawson? Can't imagine they're giving you an easy time." "They're a pleasure to teach," she said evenly. "Some of the finest students I have worked with." Prentice looked at this with the specific skepticism of a man who has been told for years that something is one way and is faintly annoyed to hear otherwise. "Is that right?" "Thatcher always worried they were slow." "Then Mr. Thatcher was misinformed," said Susanna. The pause that followed this had the quality of air before a thunderstorm. Prentice's 2 hired men exchanged a glance. Then Jacob appeared from the direction of the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and Prentice's attention shifted to him, and the whole conversation rearranged itself around a land matter, water rights along the southern Arroyo, apparently in dispute, with Prentice claiming a portion that Jacob flatly denied. Susanna gathered the boys and their papers and moved the lesson indoors without making a point of it, but she sat near the open window and she listened, because she had learned long ago that understanding the full situation around a household was part of understanding the household. The disagreement was not new. It had the rhythm of something long-running. Prentice wanted access to the arroyo that ran through the southeast corner of Thatcher land, claiming it as a historic water right. Jacob denied the claim was legally registered. Prentice suggested that a man alone with 2 boys and a hired hand and a half had perhaps overextended himself in holding that much land. Jacob said, with a quietness that Susanna recognized as more dangerous than raised voices, that he would be keeping every acre his deed described, and every drop of water his property rights included, and that if Prentice had a legal dispute, he was welcome to register it with the territorial court in Tucson. Prentice rode away looking like a man who had expected an easier conversation. Jacob came inside and stood in the main room for a moment, rolling down his sleeves. His jaw was set in the particular way Susanna had begun to recognize as contained anger. The boys watched him from behind their books with the alertness of children who have seen this before. "Is he a real threat?" Susanna asked quietly. The boys looked at her, a little surprised by the directness. Jacob looked at her too. "Prentice, he's a nuisance. He's been trying to push in on the arroyo water since before Eleanor passed. He thought maybe after she died I'd be less inclined to fight him. He was wrong." "You have the deed registered properly." "I do. Lawyer in Tucson. Hector Vargas knows every inch of those property lines and has for 12 years. "Good," said Susanna. "Then the answer is simple if not easy." Jacob looked at her for a moment longer. Something in his expression softened almost imperceptibly, the way the desert softens right at the edge of sunset, all the harsh lines going golden for a brief time. Then he nodded and went back outside. Thomas tapped his pencil on his geography paper. "Mr. Prentice has been trying to take our water since I was 6, he said matter-of-factly. "Eli says that men like that only understand one language." "What language is that?" Susanna asked. "The law," said Eli from behind his book, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had already worked this out. "Your brother is right," said Susanna, "which is precisely why every one of you should know as much about the law as you can manage." She added territorial property law to the curriculum the next morning. Thomas complained briefly, and then became fascinated when he realized how much of it came down to mathematics and surveying. And Eli, who had apparently already read the relevant sections of the United States Revised Statutes of 1878, began annotating the margins of Susanna's notes in his small, precise hand. The weeks turned into the better part of a month, and the ranch settled around Susanna in the way that places do when you stop being a visitor and start being a presence. She learned its rhythms, the rooster at dawn, the sound of Hector singing something quietly in Spanish as he worked the morning corral, the metallic ping of Pete Drummond's boots on the porch steps. She learned the smell of the adobe house in the morning when the walls released the cool they'd gathered overnight, and the way the cottonwoods along the arroyo sounded in the late afternoon wind, which was a sound she decided she would remember for the rest of her life. She and Jacob had fallen into a habit of evening conversation that neither of them had planned or announced. After the boys were in bed and she had finished marking their work, she would set aside her papers, and more often than not Jacob would be at the table with his accounts or, increasingly, with a book. He had begun reading again. She noticed the books changing on the table beside his chair, first a history of the American Southwest, then a natural philosophy text, then a collected edition of the speeches of Abraham Lincoln. He did not announce this or mention it in any direct way. He simply read, and sometimes he said things at dinner that had clearly come from something he had been reading, and his sons noticed, she could see them noticing, and there was something in Eli's face when he watched his father that was very close to relief. One evening in mid-May, with the windows open to the warm night air and the sound of a coyote calling in the far distance, Jacob closed his book and looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. Susanna looked up. "For what?" "The advertisement. I told you my sons needed basic schooling. That was because that's what Mrs. Dalton told me after she left, and I believed her because she had the certificate and I didn't see them clearly." He stopped. I think I was so busy worrying about whether they were going to be all right without their mother that I stopped actually looking at who they were." Susanna set her pen down. She had heard many varieties of regret in her life, and she could tell the real ones from the performances. This was real. "They are extraordinary," she said simply. "And I think they knew you thought they were falling behind. Children always know." "Yes," he said quietly. "I expect they do." "Have you told them?" "Told them what?" "That you see it now, what they are." He was quiet for a moment. The coyote called again, further away now. "I'm not a man who says things like that easily." "I know," she said. "But I think in this case it might be worth the difficulty." He looked at her across the table with the lamplight between them, and she felt, in a way that was new and a little alarming and also completely unmistakable, that he was not just seeing her teaching certificate or her directness or her usefulness to his household. He was seeing her, the specific, particular thing that she was, and he was finding it, she thought, genuinely remarkable. She looked back at her papers. "Good night, Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Good night, Miss Lawson," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. She lay in the guest room for a long time that night, looking at the ceiling, listening to the desert sounds, thinking about what it meant to be truly seen by someone, and how terrifying and extraordinary that was after so much time of being looked past. The next morning at breakfast, before the lessons began, Jacob set down his coffee cup and looked at both his boys and said, in a voice that was slightly rougher than his normal morning tone, "I've been talking with your teacher. And I think I owe you both an honest word. I know I've been worrying you were behind in your studies, and I know now that I was wrong about that, and I'm sorry for letting you think I thought less of you than you deserved. You are your mother's sons, and that is not a small thing." Thomas's spoon stopped moving in his oatmeal. Eli looked at the table for a moment and then looked up at his father with eyes that were slightly too bright. "We know you worry," Eli said finally. "We know it's because you care." Thomas set his spoon down and wrapped both his small arms around his father's arm in the summary, unambiguous way of 9-year-olds who have decided a hug is necessary. Jacob put his hand over his younger son's head and closed his eyes briefly, and Susanna, from the doorway where she had arrived with her teaching papers, witnessed this without making a sound and felt something shift in the center of her chest like a door opening inward. She went back down the hall and gave them another minute, and when she came in again, they were all three sitting at the table, and Thomas was asking his father whether he thought the territorial legislature would ever address water rights more precisely, and the conversation was ordinary and extraordinary all at once. The summer came in hard and bright and punishing, the way Arizona summers do, temperatures that made the air shimmer above the desert floor, the scrub plants going silver and gray, the cattle moving slow and heavy to whatever shade they could find. The lessons moved to the early mornings and early evenings, with the midday hours given over to the heat. Susanna wrote to the San Francisco bookseller again, and received a crate of new volumes that Thomas fell upon like a starved man at a feast, including a recent scientific paper from the Smithsonian Institution that sent him into 3 days of intense annotation. Eli worked through Virgil's Aeneid in the original Latin, and then, at Susanna's suggestion, began writing his own translation with marginal notes on the choices she made versus other scholars' work that she told him, with complete honesty, was better than several academic translations she had read. Eli received this information the way he received most good information, with a small nod, no visible vanity, and then immediate return to the work. She was teaching them well. She was also, she knew, being changed by them, by the specificity and seriousness of their minds, by the openness and trust they had given her more quickly than most children she had taught. She had not expected this assignment to feel like the right place. She had expected it to be a practical matter, a position, a use of her skills while she worked out the larger question of where she belonged in this territory that had so far mostly declined to offer her a place. But the ranch was beginning to feel, in some difficult-to-articulate way, like somewhere she had been heading without knowing it. There was a social gathering in Millhaven on the third Saturday of June, a summer celebration that the town organized each year around the end of spring roundup, with music and food in the town square and general goodwill among people who did not see enough of each other during the working season. Jacob took the boys and took Susanna because it seemed strange not to include her at this point, and because Eli asked if she could come with the directness of a boy who did not yet understand that his questions were not always simple ones. Millhaven was a town of perhaps 200 permanent residents, with the usual frontier architecture of wood frame buildings along a main street, a proper hotel, a saloon, a church, a dry goods store that was Prentice's Mercantile, and which was, accordingly, the most prosperous structure on the block. The summer social brought people from ranches and farms across a 30-mile radius, and Susanna found herself introduced to more people in 2 hours than she had met in her entire month on the Thatcher ranch. She noticed the way they looked at her, at the schoolteacher Thatcher had hired from out east. She noticed the way several of the women, after sizing her up with the quick, experienced assessment of women who live in communities where resources including eligible men are scarce, warmed toward her noticeably, once she made clear that she had opinions about things beyond schoolrooms, and that she was also genuinely interested in theirs. She spent a long time talking to a woman named Rosalinda Vargas, who was Hector's wife, and who lived on a small property adjacent to the Thatcher land. Rosalinda was a sharp and funny woman with a large family and a command of 3 languages, and she told Susanna things about the territory, about the Apache situation, about the land disputes, about the history of water rights in the region that no one had put in the newspapers. She also looked, at one point, across the town square and found Jacob Thatcher watching her. He looked away immediately. But she had seen his face in the moment before he looked away, and the expression on it was one she understood suddenly and completely, the way you understand something you have been half aware of for some time. It was not casual interest. It was not neighborly regard. It was the look of a man who has been trying not to look and has momentarily failed. Her heart did something emphatic and inconvenient. She turned back to Rosalinda and continued the conversation about territorial water law as though nothing had happened, which was both a lie and a skill. Prentice appeared at the social, as he would, because it was his town and his square, more or less, and because he had the kind of personality that filled available space. He was civil to Jacob in the public way of men who have a fight ongoing and don't want to enlarge it. He was less civil to Hector Vargas, who received a cutting remark about his property claim with the absolute stillness of a man who has been enduring such remarks for decades, and has learned that the most effective response is to grant them no oxygen. Susanna watched this exchange from a distance and felt the specific anger of someone who is a guest in a situation and has no direct recourse. She filed it away, in the manner she had of noticing injustices and deciding when and how they could be addressed. Pete Drummond, who had come to the social with evident excitement about the dancing portion, asked her if she danced, and she did, 2 sets with him and one with a young farmer named Creighton who stood on her foot twice but apologized so sincerely she forgave him both times. She was between dances, standing near the edge of the square with a glass of lemonade that was too warm but genuinely welcome, when Jacob appeared beside her. "You dance," he said. "When invited," she said. "Do you?" Not in some time. He was looking at the dancers. Elinor liked dancing. She looked at the side of his face. There was a lot of history in his profile, the years of weather, the particular way a face looks when it has held too much grief for too long and has only recently begun to let it shift. "Mr. Thatcher," she said, "I have a question that may be forward." He turned to look at her. "I think at this point you have earned the right to be forward," he said, and there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard quite before, something lighter, almost amused. It changed the whole landscape of his face. "How are you?" she asked, not the social formulation, the real question. He looked at her for a long moment. Around them the music played and the dancers moved and the evening light went gold and copper over the desert. "Better," he said. "These past weeks better." He paused. "Those are words I didn't think I'd be saying this summer." "I am glad," she said. "Are you happy here, Miss Lawson?" His voice had shifted slightly. "On the ranch, is it? Do you find it enough?" She thought about this honestly because she was a person who tried to think honestly. She thought about the morning lessons with the boys, about Eli's translation work and Thomas's careful journals, about the evenings at the long pine table and the books and the lamplight and the desert sounds coming through the open windows. She thought about the particular quality of the silence in the adobe house at night, which was a silence that had never felt empty to her. "More than enough," she said, "more than I expected." The music changed to a slower tempo. On the square, couples reorganized themselves. "Would you—" Jacob stopped. He tried again. "Would you like to dance?" She looked up at him. The evening light was catching the planes of his face, and he was looking at her with that unguarded expression she had been catching in brief, fleeting glimpses for weeks. The look of a man who has stopped trying to manage what he feels. "I would," she said. He danced carefully, with the self-consciousness of someone who had not done it in years, but he was not ungainly. He had the body awareness of a man accustomed to physical work, and once he had the rhythm he held it. She was aware of the warm solidity of his hand at the small of her back and the way he looked at her, not past her shoulder but directly at her, with an attention that felt like a physical thing. "I should tell you," he said, when they had been dancing for a minute and had navigated successfully around two other couples, "that when I put that advertisement in the paper I expected someone different." "Different how?" "Older. Less." He stopped. "I thought you would be more manageable," he said finally, with the honesty of a man who has decided that honesty is actually easier. "I thought I would need to explain things to you, tell you about the boys, that they were falling behind, that they needed patience, that they were difficult. And instead you told me that everything I thought I knew about them was wrong and you were right, and you made it—" He paused, looking for the word. "You made it seem obvious, the way you see them, the way you see things. You look at something and you see what it actually is, and you say so without hesitating." He looked at her. "I had forgotten that people could do that." They moved together to the end of the piece and the music stopped and they were standing closer than they had been, and the evening had gone to purple and gold around them, and all the noise of the social seemed to belong to a different distance. "Mr. Thatcher," she said. "Jacob," he said. "I would if you wouldn't mind." "Jacob," she said, and the name in her mouth felt like something she had been holding off. He did not try to kiss her. She did not expect him to. Not here in the middle of the Millhaven town square with everyone in the county watching. But the conversation had said a thing that didn't need saying again, and they both knew it, and they walked back to where the boys were sitting with Pete Drummond, who had found a girl who wanted to dance and was now in a state of high enthusiasm about this development. And the rest of the evening passed in the ordinary warmth of a summer social, but something had changed, and she knew it, and he knew it. July arrived with a letter. It came with the weekly mail delivery from Millhaven and was addressed to Susanna Lawson in a handwriting she recognized immediately. Her sister Clara's, precise and slightly backward slanting, written from Kansas City. The letter was long and affectionate and full of family news, but it also contained a passage that Susanna read twice and then set aside and thought about seriously for the rest of the afternoon. There was a position, a real position, established and permanent, as head schoolmistress of the Kansas City School for Young Women, which was a proper institution with a salary 3 times what she was earning and an endowment, and a library with more volumes than most in the territory. Clara had put in a word with the board, apparently, and they were very interested, and the position would begin in September. September was 8 weeks away. She did not mention the letter at dinner that evening. She did not mention it the next day either. She continued the lessons with the boys. They were deep in a project now, a joint endeavor of Thomas's practical observation notes and Eli's theoretical frameworks, a genuine natural history study of the plants and animals of the Sonoran Desert that Susanna had gently suggested might be worth writing up formally. The boys had taken to this with full investment. Eli was drafting text. Thomas was producing careful hand-drawn illustrations that were, frankly, excellent. She thought about Kansas City. She thought about the salary and the library and the permanence and the respectability of it, the clean, simple fact of being somewhere she had a defined role and a clear future. She thought about the long pine table and the lamplight and a man who had started reading again, and two boys who were writing a natural history that would probably be genuinely publishable, and the cottonwood trees along the arroyo and the sound of the desert at night. She showed Jacob the letter on a Thursday evening. She simply set it on the table in front of him without preamble, which was her way, and watched him read it. His face changed as he read. It went through several things in succession: understanding, then something tighter and harder to name, then the careful blankness of a man who is deciding how to respond rather than reacting directly. He folded the letter and set it down and looked at his hands on the table. Kansas City, he said. Yes. Head schoolmistress. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the night sounds had started: the crickets, the far-off coyote, the soft movement of the horses in the near corral. It's a good position, he said finally. It is. He looked up. What are you thinking about doing? She met his eyes. I am thinking about it honestly, she said. I would not lie to you about that. No, he said. I don't think you lie about anything. He picked up his coffee cup and then set it back down without drinking from it. Miss Lawson's Susanna, the use of her given name was deliberate and careful and cost him something visible. I am going to say something that I have no right to say and that you are under no obligation to receive. Say it, she said. He looked at her. I don't want you to go. The silence after that was the kind that has weight and texture and a temperature all its own. I am aware, he said, his voice slightly rough, that what I am saying is not a simple thing, that it has implications. That I am a widower with 2 sons and a cattle ranch in the Arizona territory, and you are a woman with a teaching certificate and a position in Kansas City and every practical reason in the world to take it. He stopped. I am also aware that I have not, he stopped again, and then pushed through it, that I have not said clearly enough what I mean, so I will say it clearly. These past months have been the first time in 3 years that this house has felt like something other than a place I manage. You did that, you and the boys together. I look forward to the evenings in a way I had stopped looking forward to anything. I look forward to what you are going to say. I think about, he looked away and then back. I think about you a great deal more than is convenient, and I think you already know that, and I am asking you not to take a position you may want and may deserve, but to think about what else you might want. If anything, he looked directly at her, if anything is here. Susanna Lawson had been a decisive person her entire life. She had decided to become a teacher at 14. She had decided to take the teacher's certificate examination while everyone around her was planning marriages. She had decided to come west with $73 and a satchel when St. Louis offered her nothing. She made her decisions the way she taught, directly after honest assessment, without pretending there were easier options if there weren't. She looked at Jacob Thatcher, who had just made himself more vulnerable than was natural to him and was sitting very still, waiting. I think, she said, that something is here. He let out a breath. It was quiet, but she heard it. I think, she continued, that it would be dishonest to pretend I have been indifferent to you. I have not been. I have been carefully not indifferent, which is its own kind of thing. She looked at the table and then back at him. But I need to know, Jacob, that it is me you are considering and not the situation. Not someone to be here for the boys and to make the house feel like what it used to feel like. I need to know the distinction matters to you. He got up from his chair. He came around the table, which surprised her slightly. He was a man of measured movements. He stood in front of her and looked at her with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before, an expression stripped of all management and guardedness, as open as she had ever seen him. It is you, he said. It has been you specifically, not the idea of someone. You, The way you looked at my sons before you had any reason to, and told me they were remarkable when everyone else had agreed they were difficult. The way you sit at this table with papers everywhere and you are completely in it, whatever you are doing. The way you told Prentice that his claim was legally weak with the same tone you'd use to discuss the weather. The way you laugh when Thomas says something surprising, like you were waiting for exactly that. He paused. It is you, Susanna, particularly. She stood up. They were close together now, the lamplight warm between them, the house quiet around them. Then I am not going to Kansas City, she said. He raised his hand and touched her face with a gentleness that was startling in such a work-roughened hand. A single brief touch at her temple where a wisp of hair had come loose, the way it always did. She turned her face very slightly into that touch. He kissed her. It was quiet and careful, and then, for a moment, entirely not. And when he lifted his head, they were both standing closer than they had been, and neither of them stepped back. She started. Yes, he agreed. We should be reasonable about this. We should. They stood there for another moment being entirely unreasonable about it. Then she stepped back and he stepped back, and they looked at each other with the slightly dazed expressions of people who have just changed the shape of something fundamental. I'll need to write to my sister, she said. Yes, he said. And to the Kansas City board. Yes. And there are things to be, she gestured vaguely at the general situation. Discussed, he agreed. Arrangements, a pause, things I should ask you properly. She looked at him. A smile was beginning at the corner of his mouth. The slightly crooked smile she had been noticing for weeks and trying not to think too much about. You have time for that, she said, and her voice was slightly warmer than she usually allowed herself. Not too much time, he said. She picked up her papers. Good night, Jacob. Good night, Susanna. He said her name the way you say something you have been wanting to say for some time. The boys found out through Eli, which was entirely predictable. Eli had noticed things, because Eli always noticed things, and he came to his father on a Saturday morning while Susanna was walking the arroyo with Thomas discussing the water table, and said, with the directness that was the family's common inheritance, "Are you going to ask Miss Lawson to marry you?" Jacob, who had been in the middle of repairing a bridle, looked at his son. Eli looked steadily back. I am thinking about it, Jacob said. Good, said Eli. Because if you weren't, Thomas and I were going to have a conversation with you about it. Jacob set down the bridle. Is that right? She's the best teacher we have ever had. She is the only person outside this family who has treated us as though our minds were worth the trouble. She makes you better, Father. You read again. You talk more. Eli paused, sorting for the right word with the care he always brought to language. You look like yourself again, whatever that means. I was too young to remember exactly what you were like before, but I think this is closer to it. Jacob looked at his son for a long time, at the 11-year-old who carried so much gravity in that slight frame, who had decided 3 years ago that needing things was dangerous and had begun slowly in the past months to revise that position. I'm going to need a ring, Jacob said. Eli nodded. There is a jeweler in Tucson. I saw an advertisement in the Gazette. Of course you did. The stage runs Wednesday. Eli, I am simply saying that the timing could be efficient. Jacob laughed. He had a good laugh, low and genuine, and Eli looked at the sound of it with something openly warm that he usually kept more contained. I'll go Wednesday, Jacob said. He went Wednesday. He came back Thursday evening with a small box that he kept in his shirt pocket, and that made Susanna, who was not normally given to unnecessary observation, notice an uncharacteristic quality of almost nervousness in a man who was never nervous about anything. He asked her on Friday evening. He had arranged it, in the way of a man who takes things seriously, with some degree of thought. He had asked Hector Vargas to look in on the boys after dinner. He had asked Susanna if she would walk with him along the arroyo, which they had done a handful of times in the golden early evening hours, and which she agreed to without overthinking it, though she noticed the sky was particularly spectacular that evening, going from orange to deep rose to violet above the desert in the specific way that made the Arizona landscape feel almost theatrical in its beauty. He stopped walking where the arroyo made a gentle curve and the cottonwoods were thickest overhead, and their small leaves were silver and gold in the fading light. He turned to face her. He took the box from his pocket. He was not a speechifying man. He had none of the formal rhetoric of men who rehearse these moments extensively, but he looked at her with his whole face open and said, "I know I am not what you expected to find here. I know this is not what you came to Arizona planning, but I believe we suit each other in a way that is rare. And I love you, Susanna. I should have said that more plainly before. I love you, and I would like to spend the rest of my life in conversation with you if you'll have me." She looked at the ring in the box. It was a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone, not ostentatious, exactly right. She looked up at him. "I love you," she said, and the directness of it made him close his eyes briefly. "And yes." He put the ring on her finger. He kissed her in the light that was going violet over the desert, with the cottonwoods moving softly overhead and the arroyo making its small, constant sound below. And she held the front of his shirt in both her hands and thought that she had come a very long way to find exactly this. When they came back to the house, Thomas was waiting on the porch with the barely suppressed excitement of a child who has been told to stay inside and has managed the letter of that instruction while entirely violating its spirit by hanging out the window. "Well?" he demanded. Susanna held out her hand. The turquoise caught the last light. Thomas launched himself off the porch and wrapped his arms around both of them simultaneously, which was an impressive feat given the size differential involved, and said something that was mostly muffled but included the words, "I told Eli," and "he owes me a book." Eli came to the door and looked at them from the porch with those serious gray eyes, and then something in his face, all that careful containment, simply came down, like a wall that has been gently dismantled from the inside, and he smiled. It was a full smile, the kind that changes a face completely, and it looked so much like Eleanor Thatcher, whom Susanna had only ever known from a small daguerreotype on the mantel, that Jacob made a sound that was not quite words, and crossed the yard to the porch in 2 strides, and put both arms around his eldest son, who let himself be held without stiffening for the first time in 3 years. Thomas ran back up to the porch to join them. Susanna stood in the yard and watched and felt the kind of happiness that doesn't announce itself with fanfare but settles into you like warmth, like light, and she thought, This is what enough looks like. The wedding was small and practical, which suited both of them perfectly. They were married in September, the same month she would have started in Kansas City, which she sometimes thought about not with regret, but with the quiet satisfaction of a person who made the right choice. In Millhaven's small church, with Hector and Rosalinda Vargas as witnesses and Pete Drummond wearing a jacket that was clearly borrowed and slightly too large for him, and beaming with the enthusiasm of a young man who thoroughly approved of the whole situation. Reverend Marsh performed the ceremony with appropriate gravity. Rosalinda Vargas cried at the appropriate moment, which she afterward described as entirely involuntary. Eli stood beside his father with the quiet pride of a person who has seen something come right after a long time of it being wrong. Thomas stood beside his brother and did not fidget once, which was remarkable enough that Hector Vargas mentioned it afterward. Susanna wore a dress she had bought in Tucson, a deep blue that was impractical for ranch life but appropriate for the occasion, and which Jacob looked at when she came down the church aisle as though he had never quite seen blue before. She wrote to Clara that same week. Clara wrote back within 2 weeks, which was quick for the mail, and the letter was long and a little tearful in the way of older sisters and entirely loving, and it included a gift, a set of teaching journals bound in calfskin, and a promise to visit in the spring. Gerald Prentice, meanwhile, had registered his water rights claim with the territorial court in Tucson, which meant the dispute had moved from irritating to formal. Jacob retained his Tucson lawyer, a careful man named Mr. Aldridge, who reviewed the claim and the deeds, and told Jacob with professional confidence that the claim had no legal standing under the Homestead Act of 1862 and the subsequent territorial statutes, and that the court would almost certainly agree. The hearing was scheduled for November. Hector Vargas gave testimony about the property boundaries. The territorial judge, a sharp, no-nonsense woman of the law named Judge Carver, appointed to the position in the wave of territorial reforms, and the first such judge in the region, reviewed the documentation and dismissed Prentice's claim in its entirety. Prentice lost, and the loss was clean and documented and public, and after that he had no mechanism remaining to pursue the matter. He remained unpleasant in the particular ongoing way of men who have been decisively outmaneuvered and have not yet made their peace with it, but his ability to threaten the ranch was gone. Hector Vargas shook Jacob's hand on the courthouse steps and said, "Your wife's idea to document the Arroyo survey measurements was the piece that settled it." Because Susanna, during the preparation for the hearing, had spent 2 days with a surveying manual and a piece of rope and Eli's help precisely measuring and documenting the boundary of the Arroyo through Thatcher land. And this documentation, submitted to the court, had made Prentice's claims not just legally weak, but factually impossible to sustain. Jacob came home from the courthouse and told Susanna this, standing in the main room still in his good jacket, and she looked up from the boy's papers she was grading and said, "It seemed like the relevant information to have," and he crossed the room and kissed her in the direct, certain way he had developed over the months of their marriage, a way that still managed to surprise her pleasantly every time. "Relevant information," he repeated, against her hair. She said. From the other room Thomas's voice could be heard explaining something at length to someone, and Eli's response was occasional and amused, and the house was full of sound and warmth, and the smell of Rosalinda's tamales, which she had brought over to celebrate the court decision, and the whole thing was so complete and so exactly right that Susanna stood still for a moment in the circle of Jacob's arms and let herself simply be in it. The winter came, dry and cold and bright, the desert going silver and amber under skies of an extraordinary blue. The boys worked on their natural history document throughout, adding to it steadily, and by January what they had was genuinely substantial 30 pages of text and 20 pages of illustrations, covering the ecology of the Sonoran Desert around the Thatcher Ranch, with a precision and originality that Susanna had, over the months, come to regard with genuine academic admiration. She wrote, with Jacob's full encouragement and the boys' excited permission, to a natural philosophy professor she had known at the Missouri Normal School, a Dr. Harmon Briggs who had connections at the Smithsonian Institution. She sent a copy of the manuscript pages and Thomas's illustrations and a covering letter explaining the author's ages and the conditions under which the research had been conducted. Dr. Briggs wrote back in March. The letter was addressed to Mr. Eli Thatcher and Mr. Thomas Thatcher, care of Mrs. Susanna Thatcher, and it began, "Gentlemen, I have had the considerable pleasure of reviewing your manuscript." Thomas read the letter 3 times out loud at the dinner table. Eli read it once silently and then set it down and looked at Susanna and said, "You sent it to him." "Of course I did," she said. "It was worth sending. You didn't tell us. I didn't want you to be waiting on it if it came to nothing." He looked at her for a long moment with his serious gray eyes. "Thank you," he said, with the particular care of someone who doesn't say that carelessly. "Thank Dr. Briggs," she said. "He's the one who made the contacts." Dr. Briggs's contacts led, over the following months, to the boys being invited to submit a formal paper to a regional natural history journal published in San Francisco, which eventually accepted a condensed version, with Thomas's illustrations included. It was published in the autumn of that year under both their names, and when the copies arrived at the ranch, Thomas held his with both hands and stared at it for so long that Pete Drummond, who had come to see what the excitement was about, ended up having the publication explained to him 3 times before he fully understood the significance. Jacob held the journal and looked at it and then looked at his sons and said, "Your mother would have—" He stopped. He tried again. "She would have been very proud of you. She is, I think, still, wherever she is." He looked at Susanna briefly. "We are both very proud of you." Thomas threw his arms around his father again, which remained his preferred method of expressing strong emotion. Eli looked at his father and then looked at the journal and then, quietly, put his hand on Jacob's arm in a gesture that was small but entirely his own. Susanna watched this family and felt the fullness of it all the way through. Spring came back around. Clara arrived in April as promised. Clara Lawson, who was 28 and pretty and considerably more expressive than her younger sister, who stepped off the stage in Millhaven and embraced Susanna for a long time, and then looked at Jacob with the assessing eye of an older sister and said, "You look like someone who deserves her." "I'm working on deserving her," Jacob said. "Good answer," said Clara. She stayed 3 weeks and fell thoroughly in love with both boys, took a passionate interest in Thomas's ongoing research notes, taught Eli 2 card games, and tried to teach Pete Drummond to play chess with only partial success. She and Rosalinda Vargas sat on the porch together on a warm evening and spoke, by some combination of Spanish, English, and hand gestures, for 2 hours. She also told Susanna, one evening when they were alone, that she had never seen her sister so settled into herself. "I always worried about you," Clara said, "going everywhere, fitting in nowhere." "I was looking," said Susanna, "for this." Susanna looked out at the desert in the evening light, at the cottonwoods along the arroyo, at the corrals where Jacob was moving with the particular ease of a man in his own place. Not specifically, but yes, something like this. Clara patted her hand. "You found a good one." "I found exactly the right one," Susanna said, "which is a different thing." Clara left in early May with a trunk full of Thomas's illustrated pamphlets, which he had been writing and hand-drawing as a secondary project, and a promise to return for Christmas. By the following summer, Susanna knew she was expecting. She told Jacob on a Tuesday morning before the lesson started, simply and directly, the way she told him everything. He stood in the middle of the main room and looked at her, and his face went through such a complete and unguarded sequence of expressions: surprise, joy, tenderness, a deep and particular love, that she felt she was seeing the full version of him, all the guardedness gone, nothing held back. He crossed to her and put both hands on either side of her face and looked at her with all of that visible and said, "Susanna," and then seemed to run out of words, which was all right because she understood the rest. The boys received the news with their characteristic differences. Thomas immediately began researching the development of embryos in the natural world, producing a set of notes on gestation periods across mammalian species that was thorough and affectionate and slightly alarming in its detail, and which Susanna pointed out was perhaps better suited to scientific publication than as a gift for his expectant stepmother. Thomas considered this and agreed. Eli said, quietly and with a seriousness that made it mean more, "We will be good brothers to this one." And Jacob, who overheard this from the hallway, had to take a moment outside before he came in for breakfast. The pregnancy was uncomplicated through its seasons. Susanna continued teaching through the spring, modifying her schedule as practical, with Rosalinda Vargas becoming a regular presence in the house as the months progressed, bringing food and company, and the calm authority of a woman who had brought many children into the world and knew exactly how things worked. Dr. Mercer, the territorial physician who made circuit through the county, visited monthly and pronounced everything in excellent order. In the late fall, on a Thursday that started cool and became cold, their son was born. They named him Daniel Jacob Thatcher. He was small and loud and possessed of an opinion about everything from the beginning, which his brothers found delightful, and which Susanna recognized, with a warm amusement, as a characteristic that had apparently come from somewhere familiar. Eli held him with a gravity and care that was perfectly Eli, supporting the small head with a focused attention that he usually brought to fine texts. Thomas held him for 30 seconds and then began narrating the child's physical characteristics in a way that would have been alarming to anyone who didn't know Thomas, and which Jacob gently redirected into a private journal entry. Jacob held his son in the hours after, sitting in the chair by the fire while Susanna slept, and in the morning when she woke he was still there, the baby asleep against his chest, and he was looking at the fire with an expression she had come to know as his version of complete peace, that particular stillness that meant nothing was being managed or held back, that he was simply, fully, in the moment he was in. She watched him for a while before she said anything. "You should sleep," she said finally. "I will," he said, without looking away from the fire. "I just wanted to sit here for a little longer." "Daniel Jacob," she said softly. "Daniel Jacob," he agreed. He looked at her then across the room, and the firelight was warm between them. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for all of it." "That works in both directions," she said. He smiled, that slightly crooked smile that still did something decisive to her heart after more than a year of marriage. "I know," he said. The ranch went through the rest of that winter with the particular warmth of a house that has a new person in it. The disruption and exhaustion, and the specific joy of a baby who is discovering everything for the first time. Eli and Thomas took turns reading to Daniel, which was impractical given his age, but which both of them insisted was foundational, and which Susanna privately agreed with. Pete Drummond arrived at the door one morning with a carved wooden horse he had made himself, red-faced with the effort of not seeming sentimental about it. Hector Vargas brought over an heirloom blanket that Rosalinda had embroidered, which was so beautiful that Susanna thanked her with a catch in her voice that surprised them both. Susanna continued teaching the boys, adapting the schedule around Daniel's requirements, and the work continued to evolve because they continued to grow. Eli had developed a serious interest in law, reading the territorial statutes, the federal land codes, writing careful analyses that Susanna encouraged, and Mr. Aldridge in Tucson, to whom she sent one for feedback, declared to be of a standard that would not embarrass a legal student of twice the age. Thomas's scientific work expanded toward astronomy, having acquired a modest telescope from a Tucson catalog and begun making nightly observations that he logged with the same meticulous care he brought to everything. There were difficulties, because life was not without them. A season of drought that the following year put the cattle operation under real pressure, requiring Jacob to make hard decisions about herd size and water management. A fire in the east bunkhouse that destroyed equipment and required rebuilding. The ongoing slow work of healing, Eli slowly dismantling his self-sufficiency, Thomas slowly learning that not every question needed to be answered immediately, Jacob slowly learning that being loved was something he was allowed to accept without waiting for it to be revoked. And there was the ongoing matter of the territory itself, the complicated, unresolved weight of the land and its history, the Apache situation that Rosalinda spoke of with the complex knowledge of someone who had lived within it her whole life, the dispossession that sat underneath the beauty of the desert like bedrock. Susanna talked about this with the boys when they were ready, as part of an honest account of the history of the places they lived, not because it was comfortable, but because she believed, fundamentally, that refusing to see a thing clearly was the most dangerous choice available. Eli wrote a paper on the history of territorial land law that touched on these questions with an honesty and precision that Susanna thought, reading it, was the finest thing he had written. She told him so. He nodded and went back to his work, and she understood, in the nod, that he had heard her. The spring that Daniel was 8 months old, Clara wrote again from Kansas City. She was coming for a longer visit this time, she said, because she had news she could not put adequately in a letter. She arrived in May looking different, not changed exactly, but illuminated from somewhere inside, the way people look when something has resolved in their lives. The news was that she was engaged. To a man named Robert Gale, a civil engineer who was working on the railroad expansion through Kansas and Missouri. He was, Clara said, remarkable. He was, Clara said, the kind of person who made you feel that the whole project of being alive was interesting and worthwhile. Susanna looked at her sister across the dinner table and saw on her face the expression she suspected had been on her own face when she arrived in Arizona, that quality of a person who has found the right thing and knows it completely. "He sounds exactly right," said Susanna. "He is," said Clara. "He reminds me a little of Jacob, actually." Jacob looked up from Daniel, who he was holding and attempting to feed mashed potato to with limited success. "I hope that's a compliment." "The highest," said Clara. Thomas began immediately planning a trip to Kansas City for the wedding, which was scheduled for the following spring, and produced a detailed itinerary involving the Southern Pacific Railroad that included all the relevant stops, layover times, and points of interest, which everyone at the table received with a mix of amusement and genuine appreciation. The years settled in around them the way good years do, not without difficulty or loss or the ordinary weight of life, but with a fundamental rightness to the structure of things. The Thatcher Ranch continued to be a working ranch, and Jacob was a good rancher who adapted when he needed to and held firm when that was what was required. Hector Vargas stayed on and was joined eventually by his eldest son Miguel, which meant the bunkhouse was livelier and the corrals were better managed than they had ever been. Pete Drummond grew up, married the girl from the Millhaven social, and settled on a neighboring property, remaining a friend to the family in the easy way of people who have known each other through formative seasons. Eli, at 15, began corresponding with Mr. Aldridge in Tucson about reading law formally, and Mr. Aldridge, who by this point had seen enough of the boy's written work to know exactly what he had, agreed to take him as a student in Tucson after he turned 17. Thomas's paper on Sonoran desert bird migration patterns was published in the Smithsonian Institution annual report when he was 12, which caused Pete Drummond to buy drinks at the Millhaven Saloon to celebrate on behalf of a 12-year-old who was not present and couldn't have attended anyway. Daniel grew from a loud, opinionated infant into a loud, opinionated toddler, and then into a quiet but determined small boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's jaw, and a tenacity about whatever he decided to do that was recognizable from both sides of his inheritance. He could not quite decide whether he wanted to follow his brothers into intellectual pursuits or simply run the ranch, and he pursued both with equal energy, which seemed to his parents to be exactly the right approach. On a clear October morning, when Daniel was 2 years old and learning to say words with the methodical determination of a person who intended to have a great many of them, Susanna stood on the porch of the Thatcher Ranch and watched the Arizona morning come up over the desert, the light going from gray to pink to a brilliant clear gold, the saguaro cacti casting long shadows across the desert floor, the cottonwoods along the arroyo catching the first warmth, and thought about the folded newspaper advertisement she had tucked into her satchel in a Tucson boarding house, a lifetime ago, it seemed, though it was only a handful of years. She thought about the 11-year-old reciting Cicero and the 9-year-old with Darwin and the man standing in the doorway of his own house, holding his hat, looking at her with that complicated, guarded, searching expression that she had spent the following months slowly and thoroughly learning how to meet. She thought about what it meant to see someone clearly and say so. To refuse the comfortable fiction that something ordinary was extraordinary, or that something extraordinary was ordinary, just because the assessment required certainty. She thought about how much of her life had been shaped by that refusal, by the determination to see what was actually there and name it without hesitation. Jacob came out of the house behind her. She heard his step. She knew every variation of it by now, the particular morning sound of his boots on the porch boards. He brought her coffee, which he had started doing early in her first pregnancy and had never stopped. He stood beside her and they looked out at the morning together. Daniel's voice came from inside, where Eli was reading to him, a book of illustrated natural history that Thomas had recommended with a specificity that suggested he had strong opinions about early childhood education. Daniel could be heard making emphatic sounds of agreement and disagreement at intervals. "He has opinions about everything," Jacob said. "He is our son," said Susanna. Jacob laughed, that low, genuine laugh she loved. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into his side, and they stood in the October morning with the coffee warm between them and the desert opening up in all its impossible beauty in every direction. "I have been thinking," she said. "Tell me." "About what you said to me the first time you said you loved me, that you thought we suited each other." "I did say that." "You were understating it," she said, "but I understand why. You were being careful. You had been careful for a long time." He looked at her. "I was terrified," he said plainly. "I want to be honest about that now. I was absolutely terrified that I had it wrong, that I was feeling something that would turn out to be just the relief of not being alone, just proximity. And—" he shook his head. "It was never that. I knew even then it wasn't that, but knowing something and trusting it are different things." She turned to look at him fully, this man who had come back to himself over the years of their marriage, who had shed the specific weight of sustained grief and replaced it not with its absence but with something that could hold it alongside the rest of living. "I trust it," she said. "Everything about it." "So do I," he said. Now, she lifted her face to the October sun. Inside, Eli's voice and Daniel's voice were interweaving in the way of a reader and an enthusiastic audience. Thomas would be at his telescope notes at the desk in his room, working on something he had not yet told them about, which meant it was either very early stage or very ambitious, possibly both. The ranch was there around them, solid and working and real. She had come to Arizona with $73 and a teaching certificate and the stubborn certainty that she was meant to be somewhere useful. She had not expected to find this. She had not expected a man whose sons were already extraordinary, already ahead of everything anyone had told her, already in possession of the kind of minds that did not need correcting but only meeting. She had not expected to meet them and see them immediately, and to have that seeing felt, by everyone it touched, like the simplest and most natural thing in the world. She had not expected to fall in love with a man who fell in love with the fact that she never pretended not to know what she knew. But here was the desert, and here was the house, and here was this family arranged around her like something that had been growing toward its shape for a long time and had finally found it. And she was part of its shape now, completely and permanently and with full certainty. And that, she thought, was exactly the right word for all of it. Certain. She had always been certain, and it had sometimes cost her, and it had sometimes been lonely, and it had ultimately brought her here, to a porch in the Arizona territory on an October morning, with coffee in her hands and a man beside her and children's voices inside, and the whole wide desert spreading away in every direction like a promise made and kept. Jacob pressed a kiss to her temple, soft and certain and entirely without hesitation. "Come inside soon," he said. "It'll be cold before you think it will." "In a minute," she said. "I want to see the light on the arroyo." He went inside. The door stayed open. She stood a moment more, watching the cottonwood leaves turn in the morning light, gold and silver, one and then another and then all of them together, moving in the early wind, and felt the full and complete warmth of a life that had arrived at exactly where it was supposed to be. She turned and went inside. The door closed behind her. The morning continued over the desert, wide and quiet and bright.